माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज के वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म के बारे में। To know, as with structuralism and post structuralism, there's a great deal of debate about how exactly modernism and postmodernism differ. The two concepts are of different vintage. Modernism being a long-standing category which is of crucial importance in the understanding of 20th century culture, whereas the term postmodernism, as is well known, has only become current since the 1980s. Modernism is the name given to the movement which dominated the arts and culture of the first half of the 20th century. Modernism was that earthquake in the arts which brought down much of the structure of pre 20th century practice in music, painting, literature, and architecture. One of the major epicenters of the earthquake seems to have been Vienna during the period of 1890 to 1910, but the effects were felt in France, Germany, Italy, and eventually even in Britain in arts movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Futurism. Its aftershocks are still being felt today, and many of the structures that toppled have never been rebuilt. Without an understanding of modernism, then it is impossible to understand 20th century culture. In all the arts touched by modernism, what has been the most fundamental elements of practice were challenged and rejected. Thus, melody and harmony were put aside in music, perspective and direct pictorial representation were abandoned in painting in favor of degrees of abstraction in architecture, traditional forms and material. Pitched roofs, domes and columns, wood, stones and bricks were rejected in favor of plain geometrical forms, soft and executed in new materials like plate glass and concrete. In literature, finally, there was a rejection of traditional realism, chronological plots, continuous narratives relayed by omniscient narrators, closed endings, etc., in favor of experimental form of various kind. The period of high modernism was the 20 years from 1910 to 1930, and some of the literary high priests of the movement, writing in English, were T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Virginia Woolf, Wallace Stevens, and Gertrude Stein, and writing in French or German, Marcel Proust, Stephen Mallarmé, Andrew Gide, Franz Kafka, and Rainer Maria Rilke. Some characteristics of literary modernism are as follows: a new emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity, that is, on how we see rather than what we see, a preoccupation evident in the use of stream of consciousness technique, a movement in novels away from the apparent objectivity provided by such features as omniscient eternal narration, post narrative points of view, and clear cut moral position, a blurring of the distinction between genres so that novels tend to become more lyrical and poetic, for instance, and poems more documentary and prose-like. A new liking for fragmented forms, discontinuous narrative, and random seeming collages of disparate materials. A tendency towards reflexivity so that poems play and novels raise issues concerning their own nature, statutes, and role. The overall result of these shifts is to produce a literature which seems dedicated to experimentation and innovation. After its high point, modernism seemed to retreat considerably in the 1930s, partly, no doubt, because of the tensions generated in a decade of political and economic crisis, but a resurgence took place in the 1960s, a decade which has interesting points of similarity with the 1920s when modernism was at its height. However, modernism never gained the preeminence it had enjoyed in its earlier period. This gives us a rough indication of what and when modernism was. J. Gruden's entry in his Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory describes postmodernism as characterized by an eclectic approach, by a liking for aleatory writing and for parody and pastiche. So far, this doesn't really put much daylight between modernism and postmodernism, since the word eclectic suggests the use of fragmented forms, which, as we have just said, are characteristic of modernism. Eliot's The Wasteland, for instance, is a collage of juxtaposed incomplete stories of fragments of also aleatory forms, meaning those which incorporate an element of randomness or chance, were important to the Dadaists of 1917, who, for instance, made poems from sentences plucked randomly from newspapers. The use of parody and pastiche finally is clearly related to the abandonment of the divine pretensions of authorship implicit in the omniscient narratorial stance, and this too was a vital element in modernism. It could be said that the one way of establishing that distinction between modernism and postmodernism is to dissolve the sequential link between them by retrospectively redefining certain aspects of modernist and postmodernist. According to this view, they are not two successive stages in the history of the arts but two opposed moods or attitudes. Do you know who fits all the characteristics of postmodernism? It is Sylvia Plath. Modernism, Habermas, Lyotard, and Baudrillard. A major moment in the history of postmodernism is the influential paper Modernity, an incomplete project delivered by the contemporary German theorist Jürgen Habermas in 1980. For Habermas, the modern period begins with the Enlightenment, that period of about 100 years from mid 17th to the mid 18th century, when a new faith arose in the power of reason to improve human society. Such ideas are expressed or embodied in the philosophy of Kant in Germany, Voltaire and Diderot in France, and Locke in human Britain. In Britain, the term "the Age of Reason" was used till recently to designate the same period. The so-called Enlightenment project is the fostering of this belief that the break with tradition, blind habit, and slavish obedience to religious precepts and prohibitions, coupled with the application of reason and logic by the disinterested individual, can bring about a solution to the problems of society. This outlook is what Habermas means by modernity. The French Revolution can be seen as a first attempt to test this theory in practice. For Habermas, this faith is reason and the possibility of progress survived into the 20th century and even survives the catalogue of disasters which makes up the century's history. The cultural movement known as modernism subscribed to this project in the sense that it constituted a lament for a lost sense of purpose, a lost coherence, a lost system of values. For Habermas, the French post-structuralist thinkers of the 1970s, such as Derrida and Foucault, represented a specific replication of this kind of Enlightenment modernity. They attacked, in his view, the ideals of reason, clarity, truth, and progress, and as they were thereby detached from the quest for justice, he identified them as young conservators. The term postmodernism was used in the 1930s, but its correct sense and voice can be said to have begun with Jean Francis Lyotard, the postmodern condition, a report by Knowledge Master University Press, 1979. Lyotard's essay answering the question "What is postmodernism?" was published in 1982, added in 1984 as an appendix to the postmodern condition, and included in Brooker's Modernism. Postmodernism in 1992 takes up this debate about the Enlightenment, mainly targeting Habermas in a slightly oblique manner. Lyotard opens with a move which effectively turns the debate into a struggle to demonstrate that one's opponents are the real conservatives of some familiar bottom line of polemical writing or culture. Critics do. They discover postmodernist theme, tendency, and attitudes within literary works of the 20th century and explore their implication. They foreground fiction which might be said to exemplify the notion of the disappearance of the real, in which shifting postmodern identities are seen, for example, in the mixing of literary genres, the thriller, the detective, story, the myth saga, and the realist psychological novel, etc. They foreground what might be called intertextual elements in literature, such as parody, pastiche, and illusion, in all of which there is a major degree of reference between one text and another rather than between the text and a safely external reality. Therefore, ground irony in the sense described by Umberto Eco that whereas the modernist tries to destroy the past, the postmodernist realizes that the past must be revisited, but with irony. Modernism, postmodernism, Peter Brooker, page 220. They foreground the element of narcissism in narrative technique, that is where novels focus on and debate their own ends and processes and thereby deneutralize the content. They challenge the distinction between high and low culture and highlight texts which work as hybrid blends of the two. Postmodernism criticism, an example, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Waiting for Godot mainly shows the first of the six postmodernist critical activities listed, but also has elements of the second sense that the notion of language as a self-contained system relates closely to Lyotard's idea of disappearance of the real. The entire play, that is divided into two acts, nothing happens. The stage remains, no one speaks a dialogue. They are just waiting for a person named Godot, and in the entire play, uh, nothing happens. The second act is a replica of the first act. And Astrakan are waiting for a person named Godot under a tree. And for instance, seems to be an important activity in 20th century drama, notably in the place of Harold Pinter, the dumb waiter could be a very opposite. You might like to consider the value of otherwise using the idea of sports modernism in the explication of any of his plays with which you are familiar. Theory is a broad and somewhat ambiguous belief system tied to the philosophical and cultural reaction to the convictions of modernism, sometimes equated with humanism. Postmodernism is the philosophical proposal that reality is ultimately inaccessible by human investigation, that knowledge is a social construction, that truth claims are political power plays, and that the meaning of words is to be determined by readers, not authors. In brief, postmodern theory sees reality as what individuals or social groups make it to be. First called by the name in 1979 by French philosopher Jean Francis Lyotard in a seminal work, The Postmodern Condition, 1984, find it as an incredulity towards meta-narratives, which is somewhat ironically a product of scientific progress. Postmodernity concentrates on the tensions of difference and similarity erupting from process of globalization and capitalism, the accelerating circulation of people, the increasingly dense and frequent cross-cultural interactions, and the unavoidable intersection of local and global knowledge. Rebellious attitude that flourished between 1900 and 1930 had as its basis the rejection of European culture for having become too corrupt, complacent, and lethargic, ailing because it was bound by the artificialities of a society that was too preoccupied with image and too scared of change. This dissatisfaction with the moral bankruptcy of everything European led modern thinkers and artists to explore other alternatives, especially primitive cultures. The first characteristic associated with modernism is nihilism, the rejection of all religious and moral principles as the only means of obtaining social progress. In other words, the modernists repudiated the moral codes of the society in which they were living in. Ecoaclism, the action of attacking or assertively rejecting cherished beliefs and institutions or established values and practices. With so many scientific discoveries and technological innovations taking place, the world was changing so quickly that culture had to redefine itself constantly in order to keep pace with modernity and not appear anachronistic. By the time a new scientific or philosophical system or artistic style had found acceptance, each was soon after questioned and discarded for even newer one. As a consequence of the new technological dynamics, the modernists felt a sense of constant anticipation and did not want to commit to any one system that would thereby harness creativity, ultimately restricting and annihilating it. Modernism. When modernism ends is debatable, though the Oxford Encyclopedia of British Literature sees modernism ending by 1939 with regard to British and American literature when if modernism petered out and postmodernism began has been contested almost as hotly as when the transition from Victorian to modernism occurred. Clement Greenberg sees modernism ending in the 1930s with the exception of the visual and performing arts. In fact, many literary modernists lived into the 1950s and 60s, through generally speaking, they were no longer producing major works. The term late modernism is also sometimes applied to modernist work published after 1930, after modernists or late modernists. Publishing after 1945 were T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, and Ezra Pound. Poets were Robert Frost and W. H. Auden. Modern novels were Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, James Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, etc. Postmodern theorists argue that we now live in a postmodern world characterized by diversity and fragmentation. Postmodernists stress that society is changing so rapidly and constantly that it is marked by uncertainty, with societies split into a huge variety of groups with different interests and lifestyles. Postmodernists view the category crime as simply a social construction based on a narrow legal definition, reflecting an outdated meta-narrative of law which does not reflect the diversity of postmodern society. In postmodern society, people are increasingly freed from the constraints arising from social norms and social bonds to others. Crime is presently defined as simply an expression of a particular view of those, with part of how people should conduct themselves and denies people's freedom, self-identity, and difference. Postmodern literature is a form of literature which is marked both stylistically and ideologically re- by a reliance on such literary conventions as fragmentation, paradox, unreliable narrator, often unrealistic and downright impossible plot schemes, parody, paranoia, dark human and authorial self-reference. Postmodern authors tend to reject outright meanings in their novels, stories, and poems, and instead highlight and celebrate the possibility of multiple meanings or a complete lack of meaning within a single literary work. Many critics and scholars find it best to define postmodern literature against the popular literary style that came before it. Modernism, pastiche, the taking of various ideas from previous writings and literary styles and posting them together to make new styles. Intertextuality, the acknowledgement of previous literary works within another literary work. Metafiction, the act of writing about writing or making readers aware of the fictional nature of the very fiction they are reading. Temporal distortion, the use of non-linear timelines and narrative techniques in a story. Minimalism, the use of characters and events which are decidedly common and non-exceptional characters. Maximalism, disorganized, lengthy, highly detailed writing. Magical realism, the introduction of impossible or unrealistic events into a narrative that is otherwise realistic. Faction, the mixing of actual historical events with fictional events without clearly defining what is factual and what is fictional. Reader involvement, often through direct address to the reader and the open acknowledgement of the fictional nature of the events being described. Postmodern literature serves as a reaction to the supposed stylistic and ideological limitation of modernist literature and the radical changes the world underwent after World War II. While modernist literary writers often depicted the world as fragmented, troubled, and on the edge of disaster, which is best displayed in the stories and novels of certain modernist authors as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Albert Camus, Virginia Woolf, and Thomas Mann. Postmodern authors tend to depict the world as having already undergone countless disasters and being beyond redemption or understanding. For many postmodern writers, the various disasters that occurred in the last half of the 20th century left a number of writers with a profound sense of paranoia. They also give them an awareness of the possibility of utter disaster and apocalypse as the horizon. The notion of locating precise meaning and reasons behind any event became seen as symbols. Postmodern philosophy tends to conceptualize the world as being impossible, strictly defends and understand. Postmodern philosophy argues that knowledge and facts are always relative to particular situation and this is both futile and impossible to attempt to locate any precise meaning to any idea, concept or event. Postmodern philosophy tends to renounces the possibility of grand narratives, instead argues that all belief systems and ideologies are developed for the express purpose of controlling others and maintaining a particular political and social system. The postmodern philosophical perspective is pretty chemical and takes nothing that is present at face value or as being legitimate. Similarly, at the core of many postmodern literary writers' imaginations is a belief that the world has already fallen apart and that actual singular meaning is impossible to locate if it can be said to exist at all, and that literature instead should serve to reveal the world's absurdities, countless paradoxes, and ironies. Examples in literature are Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, Garcia Marquez's The Thousand Years of Solitude. And postmodernism, modernism, reason of and science provide accurate, objective, relatable foundation of knowledge. Reason and science are ideologies in a Nietzschean or Marxist sense, simply myths created by man. Second, reason transcends and exists independently of our existential, historical, cultural things, since it is universal and true. There is no universal objective means of judging any given concept as true. All judgments of truth exist within a cultural context. Cultural wait. Third, reason and human independence, freedom are inherently linked. Just law conform to the dictates of reason. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The application of pure reason disapproves the universal nature of a priori human freedom. Independence, freedom, Western used to colonize foreign cultures or subjugate women. Because it is universal, reason or can help us overcome all conflicts. Science is no more universal than in any other culture's definition of truth. Language is trans a one-to-one relationship between signifier word and significant concept. Language is fluid and arbitrary and not rooted in power knowledge relations. Meaning is fluid and arbitrary. Existence of stable coherent, self-independent of culture and society. The self is a myth and largely a composite of one's social experiences and cultural context. The self is an ideology. In some, truth exists independent of human consciousness and can be known through the application of reason. All enlightenment conclusions lead from assumption. In some, truth may exist independent of human consciousness, but there is no objective means of nailing it down. All postmodern conclusions lead from this assumption. Recap: a late 20th century style and concept in arts, architecture, and criticism which represents a departure from modernism and is characterized by the self conscious use of earlier styles and converting a mixture of different artistic styles and media and a general distrust of theories. Postmodern literature is literature characterized by reliance on narrative techniques such as fragmentation, paradox, and unreliable narrator, and is often defined as a style or a trend which emerged in the postmodern World War II era. Jakes Bolchakes, Derrida, Michael Foucault, Richard Rorty, Frederick Jameson are the few famous postmodernists. Modernism is a period in literary history which started around the early 1900s and continued until the early 1940s. Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman are thought to be the mother and father of the movement. According to M.H. Abrams, the term modernism is widely used to identify new and distinctive features in the subjects, form, concept, and style of literature and other art in the early decades of the present century. Eliot is considered as one of the most important modernist poets. His two prominent poems where Eliot shows his modern orientation are the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and a wasteland. Modernism is the rejection of traditional 19th century norms and earlier contentions and represented by orientation towards fragmentation, free verse, allusion and Victorian and romantic writing. आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है कैसी लगे हमें कमेंट करके बताएगा वीडियो और कोई डाउट्स है सजेशंस है तो वो भी आप कमेंट सेक्शन में ड्रॉप कर सकते हैं अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी हो तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे टिल देन कीप सपोर्टिंग द सोलफुल डायरी थैंक यू